She went to the bookcase and got out a book called Ferocious Dragons and Loathly Worms and began to turn over the pages. There were pictures of silvery dragons like the ones that ate princesses and were killed by St. George, and gloomy, evil-looking dragons with poisonous claws and fiery tongues. But the nicest dragons were the Chinese ones. They had shaggy heads like Tibetan terriers with their hair in top knots and big bulging eyes and wide mouths chock full of teeth, which gave them a smiling look. Daniel had seen dragons like that painted on kites and liked them very much. "Can you make a dragon from nothing?" he asked, when they had decided that a Chinese dragon was what they wanted. Heki looked shocked. No, dear boy, I'm only a witch, you know. I can change anything into anything else, but I can't make things from nothing. What we'll have to do is find an animal that isn't happy anymore, an animal that's tired of life, and then I can change it. To mess about with an animal that was enjoying life would be quite wrong. They went downstairs to the shop to see if there was an animal there that was bored with living, but there wasn't. So they went to the park because Heki thought she remembered seeing a duck that was no longer glad to be alive. And sure enough, there it was, sitting in a clump of rushes by the pond. It was a white Aylesbury drake. Its eyes were filmed. Its feathers were limp. The other ducks were swimming and diving and gobbling up bread that the children threw. But not this duck. This duck had turned its face to the wall. Heki put out an arm. The duck did not have time even for one quack before it found itself zipped into the tartan shopping basket on wheels and bundled off to the pet shop. "Can I watch you?" begged Daniel when they'd unpacked the animal and set it down on the kitchen floor. "Can I watch you make a dragon, please?" "No, dear boy, I'm afraid not, and you wouldn't like it. You know, it's not just my knuckle. A lot of power comes from my feet. Things happen down there that are not suitable for anybody young." She looked down at her toes and sighed. "If you come tomorrow after school, the dragon should be ready," said Heki. And Daniel had to be content with that. In the staff room at Wellbridge Junior School, the deputy head was in a temper. "I've had another letter from those professors complaining about Daniel's work. They say that take him away and send him to a private school if he doesn't do better." Miss Jones, who was Daniel's class teacher, put down her cup with a clatter. "I wish they'd leave him alone. There's nothing wrong with Daniel. He's a thoroughly nice boy, and his work's perfectly all right. If they spent a bit more time at home with him instead of nagging about his marks, there'd be some point." The deputy head nodded. "I've gone past that house again and again, and there's no one in. He's got a lost look in his eyes sometimes, that child. It's a pretty turn of affairs when the most deprived child in the class is the son of 2 rich professors." But when Miss Jones went to take her class for English, she thought that Daniel looked more cheerful than he had done of late. And indeed, Daniel wasn't worrying about how he was going to do in the spelling test or whether he had passed his music exam. He was thinking that in a few hours he would see a dragon made out of an Aylesbury duck, and nobody who thinks that can look unhappy. Of course, it would happen that on one day on which Daniel was longing to get away, his parents were both in for tea. "Well, how did you get on with your spelling test?" asked Professor Trent, who was Daniel's father. He was tall with greying hair and a big nose. "I hope you got 10 out of 10, said the Professor Trent, who was Daniel's mother. She too was tall, with thick spectacles and a strong chin. When they were both standing looking down at him, Daniel felt a bit like a puppy who has made a puddle on the carpet. I got 8 out of 10, said Daniel, hoping that this would be all right. But it wasn't. Really, said Daniel's father. And what words did you get wrong? Daniel sighed. Separate, he said, and mystify. Daniel's parents thought this was odd. Daniel's father had been able to spell mystify when he was 4 years old, and Daniel's mother said that surely, when one understood that separate came from the Latin word separar, there could be no difficulty. How many did Sumi get right, she wanted to know. She got them all right. She always does. Both professors shook their heads. It seems extraordinary, Daniel, that a girl who does not even speak English at home should do so much better than you. Daniel said nothing. One day he meant to do something that would surprise his parents and make them proud of him. Only what? If the house burnt down, he could drag them from the flames, so they were rather large. And if there was a flood, he could commandeer a boat and row them to safety. But so far there had been no fire, nor had the streets of Wellbridge turned into rivers, and sometimes Daniel thought that he would never be the kind of boy they wanted. But when tea was over at last and he slipped out of the house, his face soon lost its pinched, dejected look. He took a deep breath of air and then he began to run. Heki seemed pleased to see him, but there was something a little odd in her manner. Is he finished? Have you done it? Asked Daniel eagerly. Of course, said Heki stiffly. What I do, I do. It's just... She led him upstairs and pointed to a dog basket she had brought up from the shop. The new familiar was sitting in it, a Chinese dragon, about the size of a dachshund, with a black topknot of hair, big red eyes, fiery-looking nostrils, and a pair of wings set close behind his ears. Oh, said Daniel, he's beautiful. He's the most beautiful dragon in the world. Yes, he is, isn't he? Said Heki. Most of him, anyway. Daniel moved closer. The dragon's neck and shoulders were covered in green and golden scales. His pearl-tipped talons gripped the rim of the basket, and his teeth were pointed and razor-sharp. So far, so good. It was the back of the dragon that was, unexpected. Heki cleared her throat. You see, I was just in the middle of changing him when the bell rang, and it was the postman. You know how exciting it is when the postman rings. It might mean anything. And Heki blushed, for she had thought it might mean a letter from her friend Dora to say that she was sorry. I left the window open and the pages blew over in the book and, well, you see. Yes, said Daniel. The front end of Heki's new familiar was a dragon, but the back end was a worm. It was not an earthworm. It was a loathly worm, like in the book, but it was a worm. There were 12 segments, each bulgy and carrying a pair of blobbly legs, and though the dragon part was green and gold and scaly, the worm part was smooth and pale with faint pink spots. What shall I do? Asked Heki. And Daniel was very touched that she, a witch of such power, should turn to him. Daniel was usually a shy, uncertain boy, but he knew exactly what she should do. Nothing. Please, don't do anything. He's absolutely splendid as he is. I mean, any old witch could have a dragon for a familiar, but there can't be a single witch in the whole wide world who has a dragworm. Heki smiled. I'm glad you feel like that, dear boy, because to tell the truth, it would hurt me now to change him. We'll soon get him trained up. He doesn't talk yet, but he understands quite a lot already. She patted the dragworm's head and he shot out his forked tongue and licked her hand. We're in business, Daniel. You'll see, this time next year, there won't be a single wicked person left in the length and breadth of Wellbridge. Chapter 6. The Wellbridge wickedness hunters met in Hecky's sitting room the following week. Hecky had asked all the wizards and witches in the town to join, and she had hoped that they might turn out to be a bit like Robin Hood and his merry men. But they had not. Mr. Gurgle, a wizard who kept a grocer's shop in Market Square, was not at all like Robin Hood. He was a small, bald man who spent his time trying to make a cheese that could walk by itself. Not a cheese that could crawl, quite a lot of cheeses can do that, but a cheese that could walk right across the room without help. And Boris Chomsky, the mechanical wizard who serviced the hot air balloons the witches used, wasn't like Robin Hood either. He was a Russian with a long, sad face and wore a woolen muffler which was stained with oil because he worked in a garage. Next to Boris sat Frida Fennel, the garden witch, who had grown Hecky's carrot. Frida had green fingers, which meant that anything would grow for her, but it was difficult to stop it growing. When Frida scratched her ear or rubbed her neck, little buds or leafy shoots burst out where she had touched herself. So anyone sitting near her had to keep her tidy with garden shears. And there was Madame Rosalia, who had been Miss Witch 1965 and didn't let anyone forget it. Like most beauty queens, she was a show-off and was sitting with her chair floating halfway to the ceiling just to be different. She kept a beauty parlour and always knew exactly what every witch should wear. Whiskers are in this year, she would say, and moles are out, which annoyed Hecky. If you wanted whiskers, you wanted whiskers. And if you wanted moles, you wanted moles. What was in or out had nothing to do with it. But if the witches and wizards were not quite what Hecky had hoped for, she felt cheered as soon as she looked at the sofa where the three children were sitting very straight with their knees together and their eyes bright as they took in what was going on. Hecky had known at once that Sumi and Joe could be trusted, and when Daniel, during break at school, had told them who Hecky was, neither of them had been surprised. "I knew," said Joe, "the way that Grilla tried to hold her hand." Sumi, too, had guessed, as she said, "If someone has red hair, they're not going to have a black moustache." Hecky had to have made up the man in the Boothroyd's garden. But though Joe was excited at once about becoming a wickedness hunter and tracking down evil people for Hecky to change, Sumi was not so sure. "I don't know. People have souls, don't they?" she'd said, winding her long hair round her fingers. "What happens to them when they're turned into animals?" "Animals have souls too," said Daniel. "That bulldog puppy was bursting with soul." But Sumi was still troubled. "I think it could go wrong. I think it could all go horribly wrong." But in the end, she'd agreed to join the club, if only to make herself useful. And already she had been useful. The mugs of tea that the witches and wizards were drinking all had tea bags in them, and the biscuits they were eating came from her parents' shop. And between the wizards and the children sat the dragworm in his basket. Hecky now made a speech. She welcomed everybody and said how pleased she was to see them. And then she told them the kind of person she was looking for. "What I'm after," she said, "isn't someone who's just lost his temper and battered his bank manager to death with a hammer. Battering your bank manager to death with a hammer is not good, of course, but anyone can lose their temper, and some bank managers are very annoying. What we're looking for is people who do evil day after day, knowing that they are doing it and still going on." "Like flushers?" interrupted the cheese wizard, getting excited. Flushers want changing. What's a flusher? Asked Joe, and Hecky explained that it was a person who flushed unwanted pets down the lavatory. Goldfish, newts, even terrapins. What's more, flushers often turn into dumpers, she said, her eyes flashing. People who dump dogs on the motorway when they stop being dear little puppies. And dumpers we definitely want. She then became practical. You must remember that as soon as a wicked person becomes an animal, he has to be protected and cared for. If I turn an armed robber into a wombat, he is not a wicked wombat. He is a wombat and has to be taken quickly to the zoo, and I shall need help for that. She looked at Chomsky, the mechanical wizard, who nodded and said he had a van which would do. Madame Rosalia, whose underclothes were showing as she floated in her chair, now said that Hecky was wasting her time. Whatever you do, there's always more and more wickedness in the world. Look at the newspapers. Every day there's some grandfather starving a child to death in an attic, or a hit-and-run motorist leaving a boy in the road. There's always been evil in the world, and there always will be. For a moment, Hecky looked tired and sad. Witches only live for 300 years, and she knew better than anyone how much there was to do. Then she brightened. I think you forget, she said, that I don't just have all you dear people to help me. I have my familiar. She pointed to the dragworm still sitting peacefully in his basket. With a familiar like that, how can I fail? There was a pause. Then from up in the air there came a titter. Come, come, Hecky, you don't think that funny-looking thing is going to be of any use? It would certainly be most unwise to expect anything from, that, said the cheese wizard pompously. Poor thing. He'd be better dug in for manure, said the garden witch. It was exactly at this moment that there was a loud ring at the doorbell of the shop. Drat, said Hecky. I put up a notice saying shop closed. Why don't they go away? But whoever it was didn't go away. There was another loud peal of the bell. It's someone with a white Rolls Royce, said Joe, who had gone to the window. An absolute whopper, and there's a chauffeur driving it. Leaning out, the children could see the woman who was ringing the bell so impatiently. She was wearing a fur coat, white like her car, and her hair was piled up into a kind of tower and looked as though it had been sprayed with gold paint. The bell rang for the third time. Oh, blast the woman! I'd better go and see. Hecky opened the door and the dragworm decided to follow her. This was not so simple. His front end bounded out of the basket quickly enough, helped by the whirring of his little wings. But then he stopped, and a frown appeared between his shaggy eyebrows. The worm part of him had 24 legs, a pair on each of his bulges, and it was not easy for him to decide which one to start walking with. The wizards and witches tittered, and the children glared at them. Then all at once, the legs on the third bulge from the end started to move, which set off all the others, and suddenly, looking very happy, the dragworm bounded and slithered down the stairs. In the shop, Hecky tucked him up behind one of the food bins so that no one could see him. Then she opened the door, and the woman in the white fur coat swept in. She was carrying a bird cage with a cover which she took off. Inside was a large green and orange parrot. Where's Sam? Said the parrot, his head on one side. I want you to buy this bird, said the woman in a bossy voice. I'm afraid I don't buy birds from private people. One can never be sure that they are not diseased. This parrot is not diseased, said the woman huffily, and once again the parrot said, Where's Sam? Where is Sam? Asked Hecky. Sam was his owner. He's gone away, and because I am a kind and caring person, I offered to find a home for the parrot. I'll take £50. Hecky was about to say no, but the parrot edged closer on his perch, and she saw his eyes. I'll give you 40, she said. To her surprise, the woman took it and left. I'll see you later, said Hecky to the parrot, and went back to the meeting. Now, she said, when she was back in the sitting room, is there anything else? She broke off. Daniel and Sumi had both leapt to their feet and run towards the door. Oh, what has happened? Cried Daniel. The dragworm had managed to get back upstairs, but there was something terribly wrong with him. His breath came in rasping gasps. His wings were limp, and the hair on his topknot had turned quite white. Worst of all was his wormy end. It had been smooth and pale with gentle pink splodges. Now all the splodges were horribly inflamed, raised up from the skin like boils, and the centre of every one was full of pus. Up to now, Hecky's familiar had never made a sound, but as they carried him back to his basket, his head fell back, and from his poor sick throat there came a tragic and despairing quack. Nobody laughed. Even the witches and wizards who had jeered knew that when people are in trouble, they often go back to their childhood, crying or calling for their mothers. The dragworm had gone back to his early life, the life when he was a duck. Hecky was beside herself, running backwards and forwards with medicines and blankets, and it was the garden witch who said, Wait, I've seen this before, seen it with Mad Millicent's familiar. She scratched her head, but Hecky was far too worried to clip off the green shoot that burst out between her eyebrows. The fiercest witch in the East she was, and her familiar with her. The cheese wizard nodded. That's right. He was a lizard, and he'd come on just like that when there was some evil in the place. And Wall-Eyed William's familiar too. A needle he was, a real brute, and he used to come out in great red boils under his feathers. A proper help it was to William. You mean? Hecky looked up, and she was blushing. Are you saying? Oh, surely not. I'm only an ordinary witch. Surely I couldn't have made one of you, you know, them. The wizards and witches nodded and looked at Hecky with a new respect. Made what? Jo wanted to know. A detector. A wickedness detector. A familiar who comes over queer when he meets anyone wicked, cried Hecky, clapping her hands, and Daniel felt quite cross. How could she look so pleased when the dragworm was suffering, though actually he was beginning to look a little better. Some of the black was returning to his hair, and the spots were fading. A wickedness detector. Oh my, so we'll always know for certain whether somebody's evil or not. Well, there's nothing to stop us now. Yes, but who made him come out in spots like that? Asked Jo. Everybody looked at everybody else. In the silence, they could hear the parrot still asking, Where's Sam? Where's Sam? Of course, cried Hecky. The woman in the shop. The woman with the white Rolls Royce. After her children. Find out everything you can about her. Everything. Chapter 7. It didn't take the children long to trace the owner of the white Rolls Royce. Her name was Mrs. Winnipeg, and she was one of the richest women in Wellbridge. She didn't just have a white Rolls Royce, she had a white BMW and a white Jaguar. She lived alone in a house with 7 bedrooms and a private swimming pool, and owned 7 fur coats, 3 of them mink. and she made her money looking after old people. But that's a good thing to do, surely, said Daniel, when they had reported back to Heki. So why was the dragworm so ill when he saw her? Could the dragworm be wrong? Nobody thought so, but it was odd all the same. We'll just go on sniffing round, said Heki. For one thing, I'd like to know why she sold that parrot. For the parrot still said nothing except, "Where's Sam?" and had to be coaxed to eat. The way Mrs. Winnipeg looked after old people was to run a number of rest homes where they could go when they were too old or ill to look after themselves. They were called the Sundown Homes, and it so happened that one of them was at the bottom of Daniel's street. It was made up of 3 old houses knocked together, and from the front it looked nice enough. The brass plate was brightly polished, the paintwork looked new. But now Daniel slipped into the alleyway behind the houses where no one ever went. And here it was very different. The windows were dirty, the dustbins were overflowing, and one could see the wispy grey heads of the old people herded together in a dingy room. The children began to ask questions in the neighbouring shops and to hang round the home to see if they could find out more. But it seemed that nobody wanted to talk about Mrs. Winnipeg and her Sundown Homes. And then, on the 3rd day, when Daniel just happened to be loitering there after school, the door burst open and a nurse in a blue uniform came stumbling down the steps and bumped right into Daniel. She was Irish and very young, and she was crying. "That place, that awful place," she sobbed. "I can't stand it any more. I'm leaving." And because Daniel had a listening sort of face and she had to talk to someone, she told him what it was like in the building she'd just left. She told him about the bullying and the disgusting food and the way the old people were sent up to bed at 6 o'clock to save the heating. She told him about Miss Merrick, who so loved flowers and had been told she could have a window box. And then when she spilled a little bit of earth because her hands were shaky, Mrs. Winnipeg had screamed at her and taken the window box away. She told him about Major Holden, who'd fought in 2 world wars and asked for some boot polish because he liked to keep himself neat, even if he couldn't see too well, and who'd been locked in his room for making a fuss. "She's a fiend, that Mrs. Winnipeg. She ought to burn in hell," said the nurse, mopping her eyes. "All her homes are like that, and the poor old things never get out once they get hold of them. She takes their pension books and their savings and burns the letters they write, so no one ever knows." "Can't the council do anything?" Daniel asked. The nurse shrugged. "People have complained, but she's buttered up the councillors for years. I mean, to stick it out, but that old chap and his parrot was the last straw. Such a nice bloke. Been in the Navy all his life and no bother to anyone. He only came because she said he could keep his parrot. And now she's told him it's dead. You should see him. He won't last a month the way he's going. And the parrot isn't dead. I saw the chauffeur put it in the boot of her car. She'll have flogged it or torn its feathers out for a hat." "Is his name Sam?" asked Daniel. "The gentleman with the parrot?" The nurse blew her nose and looked at Daniel. "Yes," she said, "it is." So now they knew why the dragworm had come out in those dreadful boils. Mrs. Winnipeg was what is called a granny farmer, and there is probably nothing more unpleasant in the world. But Mrs. Winnipeg was about to get a big surprise. And that's where I'm leaving it for today.